Hello, welcome to Insert Disc, where I talk at an unreasonable length about video games, and today this is Unreal. We're going to talk about Unreal at an unreasonable length, and before we really start off here, I want to say I wasn't too happy with my first episode. My delivery was a little stiff, and the editing was a little sloppy. This is my first time really using Premiere, so it's a learning process, but as these go on, I'm hoping to improve more and more. Now, if you're still with me, we're going to talk about Unreal some more. Yay! Today we're going to focus on enemies, the AI of the enemies, and weapons, and we're going to be bringing in Quake 2 a lot in this episode, because those two games are very much linked together, possibly forever, thanks in large part to the long-standing rivalry that both games had, and the close proximity of the release of both, so let's get right on to it, huh? If you watched my first video, you might remember a scene on the beginning of the Vortex Rikers where you see a green alien thing standing over the bodies of some dead crewmates. That's a scar. They're standing on top of them. They're kind of askew. Well, in any case, they're who you fight throughout the game in one form or another, with varying degrees of difficulty. They are your main antagonists. While there are other enemies like the fat guys with rocket pistols or the squid thing with the stinger, I still don't really know what the deal with it is. The Scar are immediately set up as your true challenge. In a stage immediately following the Vortex Rikers and the initial reveal of the world, the Rajagar Mines, there's a really nice piece of world building in that level itself, and it involves once again the Scar. You're tasked with completing an objective to cut power to a force field that's impeding your progress, and once you do, the music cuts out. You know something's going to happen. That's the only reason music cuts out, As you walk your way past the winding corridors where you came from, you're cut off by two metal bars, and they're on both sides, so you can't go anywhere. The lights begin to cut out. It enshrouds you in darkness, and all you have is a few flares and a handful of dead bodies. It sets an ominous tone. Their pistol is conveniently left close, though. Several moments pass. A few seconds really feel like a few minutes here, and then all of a sudden, you're greeted with your first Scar of the game to fight, and it's unlike any other FPS grunt you've encountered. To say they're quick is an understatement. They are so fast, they render a lot of your projectile weapons almost entirely useless. It forces you to rely on traditional hit scan to land anything. They weave back and forth, you don't know if they want to close distance, one moment shooting balls of energy and the next trying to claw at you. It makes you, the player, feel completely outmatched physically. The game is reminding you that you'll need to focus on outsmarting them or simply outgunning. It helps set the stage for the rest of the encounters, really. The fat rocket guys hit hard, sure, but they don't feel like much of a threat. The Scar, however, do. Every fight with one feels like a life and death situation, and they are a consistent threat throughout the game. Some of the most commonplace enemies, and easily the most dangerous. It's fairly uncommon for a first-person shooter like Unreal to make the common grunt a considerable threat or seem like it. In a lot of games like Quake 2, for example, the grunt was just used as cannon fodder. You put a bunch of them in a room and the player feels big and strong by killing a bunch of them in rapid succession in a big room. It's satisfying to be able to use your weapons in such a way, but in Unreal, you hardly ever, if at all, run into situations like that. Usually it's groups of 2 or 3 enemies, and each one of those enemies is dangerous in their own right. To me, this is framing an enemy. Setting an enemy up for the rest of the game. It was touched on briefly on the last video, but I'll bring it up again because I think it's very important. In Unreal, almost every single enemy is given a reason to feel like a threat. If you don't give the player a reason to fear something, then they're not going to. There's no obligation for them to. So you have to set that in front of the player, and I feel like Unreal does it. Every enemy is given a set piece that makes them feel like a threat, whether it be the rocket pistol firing grunts, killing a survivor right in front of you and jibbing him almost immediately with one of his rockets, or the Scar tearing up a prison ship. Each one is given something to work with, which is important for the game. It makes every encounter feel special in a way. Because if you're not going to have a lot of enemies clumped up in a room for the satisfaction of having your weapons do a lot of work, then you need to give the player something, and giving the players a challenge in almost every single room is a perfectly acceptable way of doing that. Not having a great deal of enemies in a single space was not common in the era of the Doom clone, you know? Games wanted to be like Doom, they wanted to replicate that success, and one of the things people saw when they see Doom is lots of high-paced action and lots of enemies to shoot. Unreal really bucks that trend for me, you know? It gives you a sparse amount of enemies to work with, but it makes them all the more powerful for it. It makes up for the lack of enemies admirably, while not making the weapons feel weaker for it. Now, to say the combat in Unreal was perfect and all the set pieces were great, it's not necessarily true. I mean, personally, I think the bosses could have done with a lot of work. There's a few bosses that are done well. I think the first boss in the Dark Arena, when you get into the Coliseum itself and you're pitted up against this massive rock throwing enemy, whatever it is, it hurts. The enemy gives you enough time to move when it telegraphs an attack, but it's not slow enough to allow you to take your time. You're always on the move, and it feels like you can get killed at any moment with it. It treats the enemy with respect. Respecting the enemy is important. Later on in the game, you run into the same rock-throwing monsters that you encountered in a Dark Arena, just in a large chasm next to a ship that you need to get into, which I think trivializes the enemy. It kind of throws whatever danger or uniqueness from the enemy out the window when you start cloning them. Most of the bosses are very forgettable in this game, aside from the first one, unfortunately, and it is one of the major missteps with the game. But the bosses being mediocre isn't a reason for the game to be forgotten completely. But with all that said, let's focus on something a little more fun, huh? So let's talk about the most important part of an FPS, and that is the guns. If the guns are bad, the FPS is bad. Luckily, the guns in Unreal are good. They're very good. They are great. Okay, they are absolutely incredible. Unreal's guns are quite possibly some of my favorite guns in any game I've ever played. Each one is extremely fun and interesting. So I feel it would be a disservice if I were to completely overlook the guns in Unreal and give a summarization. So let's dive in deep into the guns and figure out why each one is good. Even the starting guns. Now, as an aside, I'm going to be using some of the multiplayer levels on this, and this is going to be the only time I'll show the multiplayer levels, or the multiplayer in general, except for maybe 2, because the multiplayer is not worth talking about. Okay, let's go right into the guns, huh? I called this gun the blaster pistol. It's actually the dispersion pistol. The only reason I really called it a blaster pistol was because of how many similarities it has to Quake 2's blaster pistol. It is both a cool lighting effect, it recharges, and it's pretty weak when you first get it. Though it does have a secondary fire, which does a bit more damage, it's relatively useful for the beginning of the game. Now, generally, when you have a gun like this, you expect to never use it again unless you're playing on like the super hard difficulties where ammo is super scarce and you're forced to use it, and it's boring and it sucks. But Unreal does something that I haven't seen in a shooter before or since. If it's been in a shooter before, please correct me. But to my knowledge, this is like the first time it's happened. Okay, so you can upgrade the dispersion pistol. Now, what does that mean? That means it does more damage. That means it's infinitely useful throughout the game. You can upgrade it about 4 times, and with each time it gets more and more powerful. You can effectively triple the damage the dispersion pistol does by the end of the game, and that's a great thing. When you're playing on harder difficulties, one of the worst things about it is the fact that you're stuck with underpowered weapons in the attempt to conserve ammo, but Unreal gives you a completely serviceable weapon to use that can have rechargeable ammo. And that's a great thing, and I wish I could see it more often in games nowadays with these sort of weapon loadouts. I think the craziest thing about the dispersion pistol is once it is fully upgraded, a single standard shot from it does almost as much damage as a single rocket. they're almost interchangeable. It's kind of crazy, right? I love this gun. More games should do stuff like this. You know, don't just have a gun that takes up a slot. Give every gun a purpose. I love this train of thought. It's honestly one of my favorite guns in this game. And I don't know how many other games you can say that about the starting weapon. The starting pistol in Doom sucks. The starting shotgun in Quake sucks. The starting pistol in Duke Nukem 3D sucks. The starting pistol in Unreal kicks ass. More games need to do this. It's so cool to have this sort of novelty in it. I say novelty, but that's kind of an insult. It's a great gun. I could be here all day gushing about what makes the dispersion pistol so cool, so let's move on before I get completely sidetracked and bring up the automag. The automag is a bullet pistol, and it's about as generic as you'll get in Unreal, aside from the other bullet gun. It is also useful throughout the game, mainly because it is hit scan. So the fact that there are enemies that can dodge projectile objects makes this gun good. It makes it handy throughout the entire game. It does a modest amount of damage and can be shot fairly quickly if you want to. It's also one of the more accurate guns in the game for a pistol, and it doesn't eat through bullets, which is extremely handy. You can use the automatic throughout the entire game and not really worry about it. It is extremely good for the role it's supposed to fill. It does it admirably. Oh, I kind of got ahead of myself here. There's a lot to talk about in regards to weapons in Unreal, so I think I just extended it too far. For the sake of making sure that this is a weekly release thing, I'm going to cut it here and release the other half next week and go into more detail about the weapons. Hope you enjoyed the episode. Like, share, and subscribe. I don't really mean that, but if you do want to contribute, feel free to leave a comment, whether you agree or disagree. Hope to hear more from you in terms of feedback. Thank you very much, and have a wonderful night or day, whatever it might be.